Right, let's talk about chapter 16 now. The title of chapter 16 is Making a Living, and that's sort of a simplistic way of putting what I'd like to talk about today, which is really the word economy. We want to talk about the economy. Now, when you hear the word economy, we tend to think big things like the New York Stock Exchange or international currency exchanges or international banks or big corporations. And yes, those things are the economy and part of the economy. But the word economy itself comes from a Greek word, which is the Greek word oikos, which just means household. And so while participating in the stock exchange is an economic activity, so is what is in your pantry. How much food do you have? How do you get that? What are your activities that meet your universal needs of things like food and water and sustenance? So economics can be very, very large, but they can also be really your own personal way of surviving and how you interact with other people through exchanges and things like that. So we've talked about some of these issues before, so I'll try and be brief today. We've talked about things like universal needs, that every human has a universal requirements. We need air to breathe, we need food to eat, we need water to drink, so on and so forth. How you get these is what you need to survive is dependent on a variety of factors. For one thing is what is available. What is your environment like? So if you live in a rainforest area, you're going to have different resources available to you than if you live in a mountainous area or a coastal area or an arid environment, a desert. So what is available is really kind of what you get anyway. So you're going to have differences in your meeting those universal needs simply based on environmental factors. But also we have strategies for survival, and we've seen that for instance, Yehudi Cohen, anthropologist Yehudi Cohen, defines what he calls adaptive strategies, which describes a group's main system of economic production. Now, we've seen adaptive strategies in biological evolution as well. Every animal has some kind of an adaptive strategy for survival. But because we're humans, culture is so important to our survival that actually our adaptive strategies can be cultural as well as biological. So we've looked at some of the characterizations of economic activities before when we were looking at the chapters on the development of humans from hunting and gathering into farming and herding, and then into more complex urban societies, statehood, that sort of a thing. And when an archaeologist deals with this, they are required really to look at material culture. That's the only thing that an archaeologist has to work with are materials. So for that matter, for that reason, thinkers such as Karl Marx, that we've already seen, is very useful to an archaeologist who wants to describe the past through material means. He practiced or came up with the concept of historical materialism, as we call it. And so, as you might imagine, historical materialism is a very useful method of viewing the past as an archaeologist when the only thing you have to deal with is materials. We'll see that there's more you can do with contemporary anthropology because a culture isn't only made up of material objects, although that is the main source of communication and exchange of cultural ideas. But at least for the purposes of economy, this is the point of contact between a human and their survival strategy, right? So you need those materials to survive. How do you get those materials? And we saw this described by Marx before in terms of means of production, mode of production, and ideology, as he called them. And we're going to see that that actually there's anthropologists tend to use a slightly different terminology than these 19th century terms. That, for instance, we often think of them in terms of structure, infrastructure, substructure, and superstructure are the terms that are often described. So I'll come back to those in a little bit, but essentially it's the same thing. Means of production are the land, labor, the capital, the tools, the technology, the things you use to get what you need to survive. That is your means of production. By another terminology, that would be called your infrastructure. But those sort of practices take place within a cultural backdrop, an organizational principles of the way a group of people lives their lives that assumes a certain means of production. Marx called this a mode of production. But we've also seen the term structure, which describes sort of societal rules of organization, the organizational principles around a group of people that places all of these means of production into their proper locations. But these modes of production, or these structures, are actually the participation in them doesn't always benefit everybody equally. And so you can have exploitation, you can have hierarchies, you can have differential access to resources. And who would put up with that sort of a thing? Well, you put up with your culture because you feel that it's right and proper. And this is what Karl Marx would call ideology. These are the sort of superstructural things that justify the existence of the structure. Religion and ethnicity and even language groups can really bring a superstructural cohesion to a group. So these sorts of things are what anthropologists try to understand. There's variations depending on what kind of materials you need to survive and how you get them. So this is really and it's in such an important chapter because this is the groundswell. This is where the basis, the fundamental foundation for all society is: how do you survive? On top of that, you build your culture. And on top of that culture, you have the justification for that. So it is this ranked, this tiered relationship, and changing economies can lead to changing societies. So if you have one means of production, one way of surviving, then you're going to have a corresponding mode of production, and then you're going to have corresponding ideology on top of that. Likewise, if your subsistence strategy change, if you go from hunting and gathering to farming and herding, you're going to need new organizational principles. So as culture changes, or as subsistence strategies change, you see cultures change. And so we can actually identify the origin of some of these differences between cultures and the variety of different cultural practices based on their economic activities. Does that mean that humans are entirely functional, that they are totally logical, and that they can be modeled on mathematical means? Not necessarily. But there is something that is a basic fundamental aspect of all human groups, is you've got to have the universal needs met. So we've seen this already, and I don't want to labor this point too much because we've talked about it in a previous chapter about the switch from hunting and gathering into pastoralism and agriculture and things like that. So the Yehudi Cohen again, who talked about adaptive strategy, he defines several different adaptive strategies as foraging. This is like hunting and gathering. Horticulture, which is intensified gathering, where you maintain a relationship with crops, but it's not full domesticated plant species. Agriculture, which is domesticated plants that you're growing, and they depend on you and you depend on them. Pastoralism, which is raising animals, often ones that are herd animals and might need pasture land. And industrialism, and that is a hallmark of living in larger groups and having specialized labor, differential labor specializations. So I'll let you read about these different types. Foraging, like I said, hunting and gathering. There are very few truly foraging cultures left in the world because the other forms of subsistence strategies have so much demand on landscape. So where would a hunter and gatherer, a forager, do their foraging? Well, at the moment, they're all in the margins, places where agriculture or industrialization is not possible. So the extreme far north, so the Arctic regions or the Kalahari Desert. So these are places, or very mountainous regions. These are places where foragers still practice foraging because their habitat for doing this subsistence strategy has not been destroyed. But what was once the only game in town, which was hunting and gathering, foraging, is now extremely rare and marginal. There are some groups, and anthropologists are very interested in them because they show the variety of the way humans can survive. And they also give us a glimpse into thinking about how we might have behaved, how all humans might have behaved in the past. Horticulture is plant cultivation in non-industrial societies that is based on simple tools and cyclical, non-continuous use of croplands. And so horticulture often uses things like slash and burn. They shift crop rotation to different fields so they don't become so the nutrients in the soil don't overtax the land. Whereas agriculture tends to be a little bit more integrated. So things like domesticated animals are used to manure fields. There's irrigation, which is brought in to bring in water. Terracing can be used to actually form a whole new landscape for creating crops. And this is a lot more intensive. So agriculture is plant production on a more intensive scale. And there are costs and benefits of agriculture. That it's far more labor and capital intensive than horticulture. But it doesn't necessarily yield more product than horticulture does. So horticulture can be a perfectly serviceable way of surviving. But agriculture's long-term production per area is more stable than that of horticulture. Horticulture is a little bit less controlled, and so agricultural societies can support more densely populated areas more reliably than horticulture can. And so you tend to have horticultural societies tend to be smaller scale and population-wise, and agricultural societies can be much larger. And in fact, they can even feed things like industrialization. The pastoralism is an economy that focuses on domesticated herd animals. They can provide both primary resources like meat and blood, but also secondary products like wool or hides or dairy, things like that. In pastoral nomadism, these groups, nomads, are all members of the pastoral society, follow the herd throughout the year. And so as pasture land changes, the groups move throughout the landscape. That doesn't mean that they have to necessarily be extremely small in population, but there is probably a size limit to how you can logistically move huge groups of people through the landscape along with your animals. And the practice of moving through this landscape, especially seasonally, is what we call transhumance. Then there is industrialism. industrial economies are where a worker is, for I guess lack of a better term, alienated from the product of your work. So you are not actually growing crops for you to eat. If you are a farmer in an industrialized economy, you are growing crops to be sold on a market. And you are alienated from that direct participation in your subsistence. You are getting payment for your services. But you don't have to be a farmer to get food, right? You can do other services that the farmer requires. For instance, who makes the tractors, and who makes the fertilizers, and who drives the trucks, and who stocks the supermarkets. So this is where industrialization, by definition, a worker is alienated from the product of your work, and it is there's a separation between those two things. So the modes of production that organize the way that you get your universal needs met, of course you can just go and forage something for yourself, but we live as communities, we live as groups of people. And so how do people behave in a society, in a culture? Well, there was an economist, a very famous economist in the 1960s named Karl Polanyi, P-O-L-A-N-Y-Y-I, P-O-L-A-N-Y-I, yes, that's right, Polanyi, who defined three principles that organize the exchanges you make within a group to distribute and have access to these universal needs, these commodities, these things that you require. And these are the market principle, redistribution, and reciprocity. And the market principle is fairly straightforward, that it's when exchange rates and organization are governed by some kind of a standard, usually monetary system. And so things have value, but these things are priced and calculated, and value is determined by the law of supply and demand. So things that are rarer are going to be more, there's less supply, more demand, and they will have greater value than things that are extremely common and very easy to get. You can bargain where you strive to get the maximum, you try to maximize your benefit from this exchange in the market principle. So bargaining is part of this process as well. You're constantly negotiating what the value is, and the buyer and the seller are both trying to maximize their own profit from this. Redistribution is a system where goods, services, or their equivalents move from the local level to a centralized location where they're reorganized and a proportion is sent back to the local level. I've described this already. Early state societies were redistributive in this sense. Now, does that mean that there weren't other types of exchanges going on? We'll come back to that. No, these can be taking place simultaneously. But the king in Sumer gathered together all of the crops into a central storeroom and then redistributed them out to all of the people. So especially in things like a division of labor, specialized division of labor, somebody who digs a ditch is doing important work. Those canals that feed the water into the fields are just as important as the person who is planting the crops and harvesting them. So they need to be fed as well. And so under a redistributive economy, things become into a central location and then are redistributed out proportionally according to the rules that are set in place by those in charge. As you can see, market principle and redistribution are going to have different organizational principles to them. Redistribution seems very top-down, very much Somebody's setting the rules, and who gets what is determined by the person who sets those rules, or the group that does. So you have different modes of production that are typical with some of these different exchange systems. And then you have reciprocity, which is a little bit more complicated, but it's something you're probably very familiar with. There are three types of reciprocity. This is generalized reciprocity, balanced reciprocity, and negative reciprocity. So you want to think when you're doing some sort of a reciprocal exchange, you want to think about things like how closely are the two parties related to one another, and how quickly do you want these exchanges to take place. Because in something like with generalized reciprocity, typical of foraging societies, this involves giving with no specific expectation of anything in return. So, for instance, parental gift giving. At Christmas time, children get gifts from their parents. There's no expectation that the child is going to give something that is of equal or greater value than was given, right? So that is generalized reciprocity. You're just giving gifts. This can take place in small-scale societies. Let's say someone is a really good hunter. You're giving your product of your labor to the group. Balanced reciprocity, which involves more distantly related partners, entails giving with the expectation of an equivalent, but not necessarily an immediate return. So if an exchange partner does not reciprocate appropriately, you can actually damage social relationships. So if you show up at a party and you don't have a bottle of wine, that will be remembered. And this could actually influence and affect social relationships. Negative reciprocity is often associated with market economies and involves very distant trading partners and is characterized by each partner attempting to maximize their profit with an expectation of immediate exchange. Now, even things like stealing can be part of negative reciprocity, or coming in and taking over something. But these can coexist at the same time. You can live in a market economy, as we do, and still give gifts at Christmas time. These can actually act as social lubricants. They can create a backdrop where other types of exchanges actually take place more easily. And so maybe you want to give a gift with no expectation in return, which would be generalized reciprocity, because you want to actually get a better deal with your market exchanges. So all of these things can exist at the same time. They can coexist.